So let's play a little bit of a word game. I know play is probably not the right word because it's not going to feel fun at all. But let's do something like Mad Libs. I don't know if you ever did Mad Libs or if you continue to do Mad Libs. You can find them in little packets here or there. Mad Libs was in essence a game, and I use that term very loosely because it may not actually be considered fun at all for some of us. It might seem rather boring. The concept is very simple. It was these sheets of paper that would have a pre-written story on it, but certain elements of the story were taken out. And the fun, if you will, and yes, this tells you what kind of a kid I was. I actually thought it was kind of fun, that you and a friend would sit down and come up with the words. And they would tell you what the words were supposed to be, but they were supposed to also be random. So the key is you didn't know the story beforehand. You were just supposed to come up with a car. So a Chevy or a Ford or something like that. Or you come up with a color, purple, yellow, green. You come up with an action like running, dancing, singing. You come up with this list. That was, what you're supposed to do in the story. It told you what to come up with. Then you took those elements and you threw them into the story, and it was supposed to be fun and interesting way to hear a story with a whole bunch of really random words. So our words aren't necessarily going to be random, but I want to invite us to maybe hear this gospel that we have for today a little bit differently, because some of us here, looking around, I'm guessing most of us here probably know this story. We probably know this story really well. We probably know this story too well that when we hear the story of what we commonly call the Good Samaritan, we feel kind of good, it sounds kind of nice, and we move on with our lives. So let's take our lives and lay them next to this story. Maybe we'll hear a little bit of what Jesus is trying to help this legal expert, a different way to think about God. I want you to come up with 5 things. You don't have to write them down, you don't have to keep a list, it's not a test. But if you're able to think of 5 different things, and here's the 5 things. The first one, think of a road that you know really well. Maybe you live on that road, maybe you drove that road for 40 years, maybe you take that road to work every single day. A road that you know really well. That's 1. 2, I want you to think of a group of people who you implicitly trust. Now this can't be a literal group of people. I don't want you picturing faces and names. It's a category of people like police officers, or soldiers, or firefighters, EMS, or lawyers, or CPAs. A group of people that when you see them or someone who represents them, you think good thoughts. You trust them. All right, now that you have them, here's the third thing to think about. Now I want you to think of a second category of people who you implicitly trust. Same as that first group. Fourth thing. This one's a little tougher. I want you to think of a group that you implicitly do not trust. A group of people, again, a category, not like actual literal names and faces, but a category of people that you have compiled in your mind, who when you see them, you have negative feelings. That maybe your first gut reaction is, it would be difficult for you to imagine that someone from that group would do something good, let alone do something that represents God. In fact, it might even be hard for you to imagine that God is ever working through that group of people. We all have those groups. We have those categories, those stereotypes, those assumptions. Because that's what we do. We categorize people. We put them into boxes in our minds so that we can kind of compartmentalize all of the interactions we have. We all have people who we would just as soon prefer to be standing out there, beyond the city walls, beyond the street, beyond the line in the sand that we draw, beyond the tracks. That's 4. Be thinking of that group. 5, this one's a little easier. Be thinking of a large sum of money. This can't just be like money you can stuff into your wallet or your purse or in that bag of cash that you have stuffed in your trunk of your car at all times for emergencies. This is a huge amount of money. Large sum of money. Like it's not the kind of money that you would ever have, maybe even on your person ever. There's your 5 things. A road you know really well, a group of people you implicitly trust, a second group of people you implicitly trust, a group of people you do not trust, do not like, and cannot love, and a large sum of money. Let's go to the gospel. Our gospel opens with a legal expert stood up to test Jesus. So this whole gospel is actually a whole bunch of different word games that Luke is throwing at us. That word test. Luke wants us to know from the very beginning, this legal expert is not having a theological banter on a picnic table on a beautiful summer day like today. The only people who test Jesus in the Gospel of Luke are demons and adversaries. So this legal expert did not come to have a chat. This legal expert has showed up to undermine Jesus. He has showed up to find the holes in the legal code. He's trying to find the holes in the wall. He's trying to find the arguments that Jesus is going to make that are going to help the whole idea that Jesus has put together, help it all fall apart. He is there to test Jesus. So they go back and forth. They throw back and forth a couple of biblical texts that they know. In a Bible study, we could talk about those and why they use those particular ones. But then the legal expert, because he's got to be right, because he's trying to undermine Jesus, he asks this question: and who is my neighbor? Jesus replies, thinking of those 5 things. A man went down from the road that you know well. He encountered thieves who stripped him naked, beat him up, and left him near death. Now it just so happened that a person from that group that you implicitly trust was also going down the same road. When he saw the injured man, he crossed over to the other side of the road and went on his way. Likewise, someone from that group that you implicitly trust came by that spot, saw the injured man, and crossed over to the other side of the road and went on his way. A person from that group that you do not trust was also on a journey, came to where the man was, but when he saw him, he was moved with compassion. That person from that group you do not trust went to him and bandaged his wounds, tending them with oil of wine. Then he placed the wounded man on his own donkey, took him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took a large sum of money, gave it to the innkeeper. He said, "Take care of him, and when I return, I will pay you back for any additional costs." Jesus asks you, what do you think? Which one of these 3 was a neighbor to the man who encountered thieves? Then the legal expert said, the one who demonstrated mercy toward him. Hold on to that word mercy. We're going to need that in a couple of minutes. Jesus tells him, go and do likewise. This is a great story. It's a beautiful story. It's also the kind of story where we can't quite fully connect with it because we don't know Samaritans. They've been gone for a very long time. So I could dig out a whole bunch of history books. By the way, most of the history of the Samaritans written by Israelites, might be a little biased, but based on the historical text, the Israelites and the Samaritans never got along, always would have been whispering condescending words about each other. At some point they were even at war with each other because they shared borders. They shared a relationship with God, but it was very different depending on which side of the line you stood on. And so Jesus is being pushed on by the legal expert. You know, the way that you and I push against God. Whenever we draw that line in the sand and God inevitably steps over it and we get upset. The legal expert is pushing against Jesus. So Jesus pushes back. Now, if we would have been in that crowd 2,000 years ago when Jesus says the name of the Samaritan, we would have been shocked. But because we don't have any relationship with Samaritans, and that doesn't mean anything to us, we have to think about the groups who we categorically in our mind have already written off. Who are those people? Who are those categories? Who's those stereotypes? Who's those assumptions that we secretly carry that we would only ever dare confess to God? Those people who we have written off, that we've put on the other side of the line. I mean, that's why the legal expert is asking Jesus, who is my neighbor? He wants to know. Jesus, you're talking about the kingdom of God. You're telling us the kingdom of heaven is near. Okay, put it black and white. Who's in, who's out? Who gets to know God's love and God's grace, and who is on the outside of the line? Because every single one of us, every group, every church, every community has people who are on the inside and people who we want out. So Jesus, who is it? Who's on the outs? Who's out there? Who is beyond God's love, God's grace, God's mercy? He's pushing against Jesus. You and I push against Jesus. And Jesus pushes back. And he tells this story where we take our lives and we lay it alongside this story and we realize that Jesus, who's talking to us, is compelling us to confess that we have people in our lives, people in this community, people in this world who we cannot imagine that God would love. More than that, it would be almost impossible for us to imagine that God might be working through that group. Note when Jesus tells this story, when he talks about the Samaritans, or your category of people who you implicitly do not trust, Jesus uses the word compassion. Again, this story is all about word games, word play, how Jesus uses these words and how Luke uses these words. Compassion only ever shows up as something that Jesus does. It's only done by the prodigal son's father. It is a sign of love that is so deep that it messes with the guts. And this person who the legal expert, the disciples, everybody in the crowd would have written off, that too reflects God's love. That would have been appalling to this group. It would have been appalling to us if someone from our category becomes the symbol and the sign in the story of God's highest level of love and compassion. Jesus is pushing against our lines. Jesus is pushing against all the walls and the barriers and the categories that we keep building so that we can keep track of all of God's people who we encounter, those who we want to spend more time with, and those who we would quietly, secretly prefer stay beyond these walls, stay beyond this community, stay beyond our lives. Jesus is coming straight for us. He's coming right to the center of our existence, right to the center of our thoughts, right to the center of our broken hearts, as we secretly, or sometimes not so secretly, break our communities apart, break our families apart, break creation apart with our categories and our walls and our lines and our traps. I told you to hold on to that word mercy. So first the legal expert asks that question, who is my neighbor? He wants to know the line. He's already got it, but he wants to see if Jesus is going to cross it. Jesus walks right over it and keeps on going. We have this beautiful story. Then Jesus turns to us, and he asks the same question. Which one of these three was a neighbor to the man who encountered thieves? We don't get the postlude. We don't get the story after the story. We don't know what happens to the legal expert if he becomes a disciple or he goes off and starts a church of Christ or does anything like that. We have no idea. But what we can see in this story, in this interaction with Jesus, that his life is transformed. His vision is moved and shaped, even if it's only for the moment of this story. Since, of course, that's what happens when we are encountered by Christ. Our lives are transformed. Our vision is changed. We are shaped by the cross. What do you think? Which one of these three was a neighbor to the man who encountered thieves? The legal expert responds to this question the only way he can when he's in the presence of Christ. The one who demonstrated mercy toward him. Again in the Gospel of Luke, mercy is an act only done by God. It is a divine act. It's a divine movement. It is a sign. It is a revelation, if you will, of God's presence in this world. Only God in the Gospel of Luke does mercy, except for the Samaritan who does mercy, except for that person in the back of our minds who we have already written off, is a revelation of God. When we are encountered by the cross, the way Jesus is encountering this legal expert, and by proxy the disciples and the crowds around, and by you and me who gather here on a beautiful Sunday morning like this, when we are encountered by the cross, our vision is changed. Jesus breaks us and reforms us and loves us. Jesus forgives us and reminds us again of God's work in this world, even beyond our fences and walls, even beyond our categories, even with people who we cannot imagine are worthy of God's love. Jesus is helping the legal expert to remember. He's helping you and me to remember the truth that we already know, that there is no limit to God's love. There is nowhere we can go. There is nothing we can do to separate ourselves from the love of Christ. Thanks be to God. Which means there's nothing our neighbors can do. There's nothing our coworkers can do. There's nothing our classmates can do. There's nothing our enemies can do that can separate them from the love of God. God's love, God's mercy, God's forgiveness, God's compassion reaches across creation. God's kingdom keeps expanding out and expanding us out. Christ is transforming our vision. Christ is shaping us so that when we leave this space, We will see God at work in those who we might expect. But we're also going to see God at work in those who we can't share eye contact with those who we have written off, those who we keep trying to keep on the outside, because that's where Jesus keeps going, out to the margins, dragging us across the line to remind us that if we are worthy of love and grace and forgiveness, our neighbor is worthy of love and grace and forgiveness. Amen.